defense contends that a man is dead due to the most terrible of accidents. That an accomplished hunting and fishing guide, the best in the state, accidentally shot Dr. Streeter, tragically killing him. That if it weren't for a gator that fateful morning, Dr. Streeter would still be alive. And you, members of the jury, would not be before us today. But a story is all it is. And if there is one word to describe this story, it is unbelievable. Now, while the defense will try to put the perfect ending to the already colorful story, we simply want to go over the evidence that's been presented to you today and see what it says. In the end, we think that there is a more sinister explanation of what really happened Memorial Day 1995. That Dr. Streeter wasn't taken to the swamp to photograph alligators. Instead, he was taken to a lakeside cabin where he was the victim of a cold, selfish act, murder. And his killer, members of the jury, Mr. Henry Dean. Now, the defendant is charged with the crime of first-degree premeditated murder. This crime carries with it three elements which we must prove to you. The first, that Dr. Hippocrates Streeter is dead. The second, that Dr. Streeter is dead as a result of the criminal action of the defendant. And third, that this killing was premeditated. And what's more is that as a state, we have the burden of proving to you each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, reasonable doubt is not a possible doubt. It's not speculative, imaginary, or forced doubt. Such a doubt must not influence you to return a verdict of not guilty if you have an abiding conviction of guilt. On the other hand, if after carefully considering, comparing, and weighing all the evidence, there is not an abiding conviction of guilt, or if having a conviction, it is one which is not stable, but one which wavers and vacillates, then the element is not proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, members of the jury, we are confident that the evidence we have presented to you today meets that burden. But just to be sure, we want to go through each element of the crime and see what the evidence tells us. Now, the first element of the crime of first-degree premeditated murder is that Dr. Streeter is dead. Members of the jury, this is a sad, simple, and easy element to believe. Dr. Streeter is dead. We wish that wasn't true, but regrettably it is. And you heard three witnesses, and even the defendant himself testify to as much. And no one will ever try to convince you otherwise. And so the first element, first-degree premeditated murder, is bad. You can put a little check by it. And continue on to the other two elements. We must also prove to you that Dr. Streeter's death was the result of the criminal action by the defendant. Now, according to the defendant, Dr. Streeter's death was a terrible accident. And so, looking at the evidence, we should be able to see that it corroborates the story. However, when you do look at the evidence, rather than seeing that it supports the defendant's story, it refutes it. The defendant claims that on that morning, he was slowly approaching Dr. Streeter from behind with his arm outstretched, ready to pull Dr. Streeter from the gator's lunge area. Simultaneously, he had drawn his revolver just in case the gator lunged. And when the gator did lunge, Dr. Streeter was knocked directly into the path of the bull that had already been caught. But members of the jury, this part of the story is simply unbelievable. The defendant had grown up in the woods. He was a veteran guide with 16 years' experience. And even though this was not his first time, or not the first time a gator had lunged at him or a client, it was the first time that he fired at him. A firearm that the defendant had carried for protection every single time he went out on a guide. A firearm he checked before every single guide to make sure that it was fully loaded. And yet he cannot tell us with any certainty if that gun was fully loaded that morning or how many shots he fired. Furthermore, the evidence tells you that despite the defendant's claim that he was only 2 feet from the doctor, there were no stifling or powder burns from the doctor's clothing. What does this mean? What it means, members of the jury, is that Dr. Streeter could not have been any less than 4 1/2 feet from the defendant when that bullet was fired. Again, this part of the story, simply unbelievable. And And then the defendant also claims that on that morning, both he and Dr. Streeter had to walk 45 minutes to get to the swampy area. Yet, on the way back, it only took the defendant 30 minutes. Even though the defendant was carrying the dead weight of a fully grown adult male, he managed to make that walk a full 15 minutes faster. Again, members of the jury, a fact that's just simply unbelievable. And what about when the defendant got back to his truck with Dr. Streeter? You heard how Dr. Streeter was badly bleeding from both the entrance and the exit wounds that the bullet made. By the time the doctor's heart finally stopped beating that day, his clothes were soaked with his blood. Yet there is no mention of blood on the defendant's clothing. And there's no blood found in the cabin of the defendant's truck. No blood found in the cabin of someone who carried a bleeding man for 30 minutes. Now, you also heard the defendant testify that his truck had a working cellular phone that day. It was a working order. And this was a tool that, in a life or death situation like this, could be life-saving. But members of the jury, there was no call. They called the EMS. And why? It was really an accident. Why not do everything in your power to save this man's life? This fact, again, unbelievable. And then what about the doctor's camera? The defendant testified that after the doctor was shot, he threw the doctor's camera into the swamp. Yet the evidence tells us that after an extensive and exhaustive search by the police, which included specialized teams dredging the bottom of the swamp with nets, no camera was ever found. The camera that the defendant testified he threw into the swamp simply wasn't there. Again, unbelievable. And then there's a red-stained carpet that the defendant was burning the evening of May 29th. A carpet with a stain that Detective Snow testified appeared to be the color of dried blood. The very same day that the defendant claims he accidentally shot Dr. Streeter, he suddenly finds it necessary to burn a carpet with a red stain on it. Not clean it. Burn it. Now, all these discrepancies tell us that events didn't unfold like the defendant claims they did. We could end here and hope that this proves the second element, but there's one more piece of evidence that tells us that Dr. Streeter's death was no tragic accident. And that evidence comes from the only person other than the defendant that was there that morning, Dr. Streeter. 6 letters. 6 letters that Dr. Streeter was so determined to leave us that he rolled up his sleeve, took his thumb, gathered enough of his own blood, and wrote on his own arm, M-U-R-D-E-R, murder. And this, members of the jury, proves the second element of first-degree premeditated murder. Another check. And now to meet the third and final element of first-degree premeditated murder, we must prove to you that the criminal killing of Dr. Streeter was premeditated. Now, killing with premeditation is killing after consciously deciding to do so. We must show that the decision must have been present in the mind at the time of the killing. But the law does not fix the exact period that must pass between the formation of premeditated intent to kill and the killing. It must be merely long enough to allow reflection by the defendant. Again, you must look at what the evidence tells you. You heard today how the defendant was Mr. Everything. In high school, he was student body president, best athlete, valedictorian, yearbook. And then in life, he was the leading hunting and fishing guide in the state. In short, he was a man that never was never second fiddle to anyone or anything. Except there was something that he wanted that he wasn't number one in. Instead, he was second place to an unsuspecting competitor, Dr. Streeter. The prize, Mrs. Gloria Streeter. But on May 26, 1995, just 3 days before he was to take Dr. Streeter on a Memorial Day guiding trip, the defendant finally saw his opening to move from the dirty little secret to the only man in Mrs. Streeter's life. Now you heard that on that Friday, Mrs. Streeter told the defendant that she was tired of her husband. She wanted him gone for good. That bad accident simply happened, and that she hoped that the defendant was around when her husband died. And so when the defendant finally had his chance to become number one, he took it. He acted as if there was nothing ever up. He acted as if everything was normal. He kept his promise to pick up Dr. Streeter the following Monday, but he didn't have an intent to take Dr. Streeter to the swamp anymore and put her out of alligators. Instead, he had a new intent. And that intent was to take Dr. Streeter to his cabin, where he knew it would just be the two of them. And it would be here that he would make sure that he would be second to Dr. Streeter no longer. Premeditation, members of the jury, and thus the third and final element of this crime. Now, in the end, members of the jury, the evidence you have heard today tells you that Dr. Streeter was not killed because of a terrible accident. Instead, he was killed because of lust and jealousy. The defendant was jealous that this old man had the thing he wanted the most, precious Streeter. And when the defendant saw his chance to become the only man in Mrs. Streeter's life,